Hi there and welcome to the briefing room from ABC News, where we tell you everything you need to know what's going on at the White House, centered around the White House briefing room. We are going to get to our full team of ABC News reporters and analysts at the White House, on Capitol Hill, and right here in our Washington, D.C. newsroom after the White House press briefing that has just concluded, featuring Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the White House Deputy Press Secretary. Now, we should tell you, here only our second episode. It's unusual so far. For the second time in as many days, we're going to bring you only the audio of the press briefing. This is not the normal practice, but it has become the new normal. In fact, there hasn't been a single day this month where the White House has briefed on camera. It's been only off camera. So therefore, you're about to listen to only the audio portion of the briefing, picking up where the questions begin. And our reporters in the room, and again, we'll break it all down on the other side of this. But for now, Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the White House.
Eamon.
Thank you, Sarah. The president seemed fairly blindsided yesterday by the defections on the health care bill. As the White House pivots and moves over to tax reform later in the summer, what are you going to change at the White House to make sure that he has a pretty good sense of where the votes are on tax reform as that legislative train starts moving through the tracks?
The same thing we've been doing, that's continuing to have ongoing, regular, consistent contact with members of Congress. Ideally, some Democrats will want to participate in the process moving forward on a number of issues, including tax reform, and maintaining that open line of communication, as the president often does, meeting here with members of both the House and the Senate, as well as having regular calls and also having members of his administration in touch daily with both leadership and members of both houses.
And as you know, the debt ceiling vote is coming up later this year. Is there any plan to have the president reach out and make a case personally? And if he does, what is that case to lawmakers up on Capitol Hill on the debt ceiling itself?
Yeah, in terms of actual tactics, I think we'll make those decisions as we get closer to that point. Certainly, I would expect the administration to be engaged in that process throughout. Blake?
Thanks, Sarah. Let me ask you a couple of questions about health care. The president said a couple times in his remarks a little while ago that at this point he'll just let, quote, Obamacare fail. Why is it acceptable policy to let Obamacare fail?
I think in large part, look, Democrats have refused to join in fixing the health care problems that have plagued our health care system, specifically in large part due to Obamacare and Obamacare's failures. And that sort of, I think, behavior is simply unacceptable. And hopefully, with the collapse of the program that they put in place, they'll be more willing to come to the table and help clean up the mess.
Another comment about the timing going forward. The president said, quote, something will happen and it will be good. It may not be as quick as we had hoped, but it is going to happen. He also started talking about 2018 and the need for more Republicans to get elected. So I guess in the short term, is it realistic for some sort of health care agreement to happen before the August recess even, as the administration and Republicans on Capitol Hill have been hoping, or is this a much longer term horizon now?
Again, as we've said many times before, we're less focused on the timetable and making sure we actually get it right and get it done. We're continuing to focus on repealing and replacing Obamacare with a system that actually works, and those priorities and principles haven't changed.
So is it possible that this is a post-recess, maybe even a 2018 event?
Ideally, I think it happens as soon as possible. But again, we've been clear about not saying by X date, but more about let's get better coverage, let's get a better plan and a better program. That's been our focus, not the timetable.
Sure.
John?
Sarah, three Republican senators, Collins, Murkowski, and Capito, have come out against this idea of repeal. Collins, not surprising, she voted against it in 2015. But Murkowski and Capito both voted for repeal in 2015, and now they're saying they're against it. Is this thing dead before it even leaves the barn?
I think the thing that's dead here is Obamacare. I think we've seen that it's completely failed, and at this point Congress needs to do their job, and they need to do it as quickly as they can, because every day that they don't, we go further into collapsing under Obamacare. And so I think that at this point, inaction is not a workable solution, and so they need to come to the table and figure out how to reform the system and fix it.
So what do you say to these two senators, Murkowski and Capito, who voted for repeal in 2015 but now say they won't vote for it in 2017?
I think we say, what the vice president said today, do your job. It's time for Congress to do their job and do it now.
Speaking to members of the House, Paul Ryan a short time ago said it's pretty difficult to explain to your constituents why you voted for something 2 years ago but aren't voting for it now. Is that the tack that this White House will take as well?
I think that's something that those senators will have to answer to their constituents. That's not something that the White House has to answer on behalf of those members.
Yeah. Will the Trump administration take actions to move Obamacare towards collapse, like stopping CSR payments or other things that have been threatened before?
I don't think that the White House has to take any actions for Obamacare to collapse. I think you see the evidence every single day. You've got dozens and dozens of counties that have no options on the exchange. Premiums continue to skyrocket. I don't think the White House needs to do anything for the failure to continue.
But what about those CSR payments to insurance companies?
I don't have anything further than where we've been the last several months on that. Nothing new to update.
Can I ask one more question
Sure.
about the Afghan girls?
Why stop now? We're on such a roll. Everybody's having a good time.
The Afghan girls robotics team is here competing down the street. Ivanka Trump went there and visited today and met the girls. How does the president find out about some of these individual cases that he's interceded on, like Aya Hijazi or the Afghan girls team, and sort of what ends up moving him on these individual cases?
I can't speak to every single way that he finds out about information. Obviously, he has a large staff and an administration that pays close attention to a wide range of issues. And this is something that was flagged and something that he took a great deal of interest in making sure that the problem was solved, and it was. And, we're excited that they're here. Matthew.
Thanks, Sarah. Two questions, if I may. First, who's primarily responsible for what appears to be the failure of this healthcare legislation?
I would say Democrats. They're responsible.
Given
Sure.
that they're in the minority.
Absolutely. They're responsible for passing Obamacare. They're responsible for creating the mess that we're in. They're responsible for being unwilling to work with Republicans in any capacity to help fix a system that they know is completely flawed and have publicly said so. I think that it's pretty clear, and I think the responsibility lies on their shoulders.
Great. So then, just a quick follow-up. A bipartisan group of governors, including the Republicans John Kasich, Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker, Brian Sandoval, are calling for a seat at the table in a bipartisan process in healthcare reform. Is the president open to that, specifically sort of starting over with a bipartisan look at this and bringing governors to the table?
The president has met with large number of governors, talk to them regularly. That certainly won't stop at this point in the process, not just on health care, but on a wide variety of issues. In terms of bipartisan, I think the president laid out pretty clearly from the beginning of this process. He was, more than willing to sit down with Democrats. I think they've been the ones that have been completely unwilling to even come to the table to be part of the discussion. Hopefully now that Obamacare continues to completely collapse, maybe they'll decide that they want to part of this process. Steve?
What is the president's level of frustration with Republicans since they control both House and Congress?
I think he's frustrated. He spoke about this earlier today. I think his primary frustration is that there's no progress in terms of over the last 24 hours of moving this further down the road and giving Americans the system that they deserve. But I think he laid out pretty clearly that there's a small number of people that he's probably frustrated with, but I think in large part most of the frustration lies with the Democrats who created the mess but don't want to help fix the problem.
And when he says he's not going to own it, what does he mean by that?
I think he's not going to own the failure of Obamacare. I think exactly what I just said to Matthew. The failure of Obamacare, I think, rests solely on the shoulders of Democrats. They created the program. They pushed it through. They made this legislation happen, and they need to own the failure of it. Jonathan.
Yeah, Sarah, back during the transition at that press conference the president had at Trump Tower, when he was asked about health care, he said that there would be repeal and replace the same week, but probably the same day, could be the same hour. Did this turn out to be a lot more difficult than he anticipated?
Certainly, I think that after hearing members of Congress talk about repealing and replacing Obamacare for 7 years, I think that most people thought that it would probably move a little bit faster.
What did he learn about the way Congress works in this process? What did he learn about this town? What did he learn about the legislative process?
Probably that government always moves slower than it should. Zeke?
Thanks, Sarah. I want to ask you about two statements from the president. One coming up a year ago this
If
Friday.
you can speak up.
Sorry, two statements from the president. One coming up a year ago this Friday at the Republican National Convention as he accepted that party's nomination. He said, "Nobody knows the system better than me, which is why I alone can fix it." So, if the president knew the system so well, does he owe his supporters an apology? That he couldn't get health care across the finish line.
For what? Having the stock market at an all-time high, creating jobs, putting ISIS on the run, getting rid of countless regulations that have made the business climate better. Should he apologize for that? Absolutely not. We should be very proud of the progress that we've made in the first 6 months and the continued progress that we're going to make over the next 7.5 years.
Second question, another statement regarding your response to Matt. This is from November 8th, 2013 from the president. Leadership. Whatever happens, you're responsible. If it doesn't happen, you're responsible. So why is the president trying to shunt responsibility over to Democrats? Doesn't he own any of the blame here?
The blame of a program that was created and forced through before he took office? No. But the process of reforming healthcare is certainly not over, and we're going to continue to focus on reforming the healthcare system and putting one in place that isn't a failure like Obamacare. Hunter?
Thank you, Sarah. This seems like a multi-question day, so I've got two.
I thought they were all multi-question days. I didn't know that there was an option that we could do it different from day to day.
We could also do it on camera, but just an idea.
I'll consider that one too.
Is the failure of this Senate bill going to change the president's approach on this at all going forward? Will we see him take a more public role with rallies and speeches calling for health care legislation? And also, how much should we expect to see him meeting with senators about this?
Again, the president has laid out the priorities of what he wants to see in health care reform, and now it's Congress's job to legislate. And we're looking to them to work through some of that process, but we're going to continue to be incredibly engaged, specifically on providing technical assistance, as well as looking at all options for best repealing and replacing Obamacare.
And the second one thing I've been hearing a lot is this notion that it might have been smarter to pursue infrastructure first, because that had more bipartisan appeal and more likelihood of passage. Do you think there's any regret about not going for another agenda item first?
No, not necessarily. April.
Sarah, a couple questions. One, is the president going to go to the NAACP convention next week in Baltimore?
I'm not sure, April. I'll have to check and get back to you.
Is he considering?
I honestly don't know. I haven't seen the schedule for next week.
Okay, when it comes to ACA, you're blaming Democrats, but Democrats are saying there were 99 amendments by Republicans in ACA. What do you say to that?
This is still, a Democrat piece of legislation. It was written, it was forced through. 99 amendments to how many hundreds of pages of legislation. It's outrageous to make this a bipartisan bill. I think everybody knows exactly who was part of that process, and it certainly wasn't Republicans.
And the last question.
Yes, ma'am.
Some congressional leaders, particularly Democrats, are very concerned about the trust factor when it comes to Jared Kushner and his security clearance, and also still remaining in the job. What does the president have to say about his son-in-law right now in the midst of this storm, with the fact that more information continues to come out after he gave his initial statements, and they're concerned about the trust factor when he has a critical piece of security clearance that deals with issues of trust? Is the president considering allowing him to stay or leave? Should he keep his security clearance?
I don't know of any changes that would be made. The president has confidence in Jared, and I'm not aware of any changes at all.
Sarah, is it fair to say the president was blindsided last night? Can you walk us through it all, when he found out, when senior staff found out, how this unfolded?
I'm not going to get into the process piece and the TikTok and the back and forth. Again, as we've said a dozen times, our focus is on the repeal and the replace, not the process piece of it, but making sure that we get this done.
Also, Sarah, can you confirm the president did tell lawmakers again last night that they would look like dopes if they did not go through this repeal and replace?
I'm not sure. I'll have to check and get back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. I want to ask you about the president's pledge to get more Republicans elected in 2018. He said earlier today that he's going to be working very hard to make that happen. Does that go for two Republican incumbent senators, Jeff Flake and Dean Heller, who are not on board with this healthcare plan?
Due to legal restrictions, I'm not going to get into any potential election questions. John Gizzi.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. 2 questions, please.
John Roberts is bored today. He's headed out.
John, stick around.
That was a
Two questions. Even before Senator McConnell's statement last night and Speaker Ryan's press conference, the concept of an outright repeal was cause du jour in the House of Representatives, at least. There was a meeting of conservative lawmakers on Thursday who are adamant about it. Congressman Biggs has since introduced the bill for a direct repeal. Is there any possibility the administration would at least sit down and join the cause for a direct repeal before it pursued any new kind of legislation?
I think we're certainly open to having conversations on all fronts and the best way to move this process forward.
All right,
Dave,
my second question.
Sorry, number 2.
One of the things, it's been concluded that the meeting that Ms. Veselnitskaya had with Donald Trump Jr. was about eventually lifting all of the Magnitsky sanctions, which targeted top officials in the Kremlin. Now, since January, Secretary Tillerson has said none of the sanctions will be listed. Many of the Russian expatriates and opponents of the Kremlin regime have suggested that if the president could put this issue behind him by supporting further Magnitsky sanctions. Are there any plans to do that?
Specific sanctions, I can't speak to that today, but once we have an announcement, I'll certainly let you know. Dave.
Sarah, thanks. The president has said many times in the past 6 months that we needed to get the healthcare legislation done first so we could go on to massive tax reform to help the economy. Can you now proceed with massive tax reform that will give the biggest bang to the economy without having done the Obamacare part of it?
We're going to continue pushing forward on tax reform and laying out that plan. I know this will surprise a lot of people, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We're not done with the healthcare battle. We're going to continue pushing forward on that and hopefully get that completed and then transition fully to tax reform after that's over. Kristen.
Sarah, thank you. You continue to say this is Democrats' fault. The reality is they were willing to sit down at the table with you guys and negotiate to try to improve.
I missed all of those phone
Obamacare.
calls coming in.
But they said they weren't going to work with you guys on repeal and replace. So isn't it fair to say that you guys were dug in and wouldn't find common ground with them as well?
Not at all. We've been very clear from the beginning. We're willing to sit down with Democrats and talk about how to reform the healthcare system. And until they recognize the fact, I think, that Obamacare has completely collapsed and failed, I think it will be hard for them to move forward in the process. But their unwillingness is pretty well documented.
In 2012, at Real Donald Trump's Twitter account tweeted, Obama's complaints about Republicans stopping his agenda, and I'm quoting, are BS. Since he had full control for 2 years, he can never take responsibility. Doesn't the president need to take some responsibility for this moment, Sarah?
Look, I think we're taking responsibility in terms of pushing new legislation through, but not the failures of legislation that happened before the president got into office. I think you also have to take into account the outrageous obstruction that we've talked about pretty frequently up here, not just on health care, but across the board, and just allowing the president's administration to be fully staffed and be able to fully carry out the duties of the office.
And I understand what you're saying, but this moment is not about the legislation that was passed before the president took office. This moment is about the president and Republicans who campaigned on a promise to repeal and replace Obamacare for 7 years, the president for the time that he was on the campaign trail, not living up to that promise to the American voters. Doesn't he need to take responsibility?
Like I said before, the debate and the battle over health care isn't over. We're continuing to push forward to repeal and replace Obamacare, and we're going to continue fighting for that every single day. So you're speaking as if this is over and done, and it certainly isn't. Charlie?
I was just curious whether the president would be willing to sign a repeal-only legislation if that ended up on his desk.
I don't have any announcement to make on specifics. That hasn't hit his desk, but I think right now we're certainly open to considering all options to reform health care and make sure that Americans get the best care possible. Alex?
So the president earlier today had a luncheon with service members, and he said he wanted to hear ideas from them about the war in Afghanistan. Can you tell us about any of these ideas that he heard? Also, he clearly is not happy about how long the U.S. is there in Afghanistan. Would he reject a plan from Mattis that would keep the U.S. there long term?
In terms of specifics that were discussed at the meeting, I'll see if I can get any of those ideas if that's something that those individuals want to share. But the president felt like it was important to talk directly to some of the servicemen that have been on the ground and hear some of their feedback and some of their thoughts about what's taking place there and some of the progress being made.
In regards to if Mattis came forward with a plan that kept the U.S. there long term, Trump has been complaining, President Trump's been complaining that the U.S. has been there for 17 years. Would he be supportive of a plan that kept the U.S. there longer?
The president's still reviewing what options he wants to take and what decisions he'll make, and we'll keep you guys posted when we have an announcement on it. John Decker.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Repealing and replacing the Affordable Care Act was perhaps the biggest campaign promise that the president made when he was president. Does the president believe, does he fear that failing to do so will impact the Republicans' ability to hold on to the House and the Senate in 2018? Is this something that he's conveyed to members of Congress in his conversations with them?
Again, we're going to get the job done. We're still focused on doing what we set out to do. But I would also argue that the president laid out a lot of priorities during the campaign, creating jobs, creating a better job environment, getting rid of burdensome regulations, putting ISIS on the run, securing the border, protecting our country, taking steps every single day to help improve the lives of the forgotten man. And I think he certainly delivered on a lot of those things. And we're going to continue to do that every single day that he's in office.
And then, Sarah, also, in terms of what the president said a little bit earlier and also what he tweeted earlier, he spoke about coming together. Does that indicate that the president is open to some sort of bipartisan solution to fixing what is wrong with the Affordable Care Act?
Absolutely. The president said all along that his primary goal is to find a solution. He's happy to work with Democrats to get that done. Francesca.
Thank you, Sarah. You said that the administration would want Congress to finish work on health care and then it would move on to taxes. Previously, the White House had said that it wanted to see a draft plan for that tax reform before the August recess. Is that still the case, and do you still expect to get tax reform done this year in light of what we learned about the health care bill yesterday?
We're still very focused on moving forward on tax reform. It's still a big priority for the administration, and that certainly has not changed.
In terms of getting it done before the end of the year?
We want to get the biggest tax reform as possible, tax reform plan in place, and we'll keep you guys posted on timeline and announcements for that happening.
One other topic, since it's multiple question day, I wanted to ask about the legal fees. Is the president paying for his lawyers that are defending him in the Russia case or in the Russia allegations that are outside of this White House? And is the president paying Mark Corallo, the spokesman for the Mark Hazowitz and Jay Sekulow and the lawyers on his team?
I'm not sure what the structure is for that.
Thank you, Sarah.
Sarah,
sorry.
Didn't the president, though, himself, as a candidate and as president, raise significant expectations about this legislation, saying it was going to be a beautiful plan, everyone was going to be covered? And did he ever really have a plan? And what does that say about his true knowledge regarding the healthcare system?
I think the president has shown he has extensive knowledge. He's laid out the priorities that are important for him to be included in the legislation. And once again, This is not a game over situation. We're continuing to push forward every single day and work hard to make sure that the American people get the type of health care that they need and deserve. Alexis?
Can I just clarify, as long as the Affordable Care Act remains law and the replacement legislation is in abeyance, is the President committing through HHS to support the subsidies, the executive sustenance that the existing law requires?
As has been the case since we got here, we'll continue to keep you posted as decisions and changes are made, or if they're not.
And can I follow up? You just said a few minutes ago, we are taking responsibility in terms of pushing new legislation through. That sentence seemed to conflict with what you were saying earlier. Can you clarify what you mean by we're taking responsibility? What happened last night is the President's responsibility. That's what you're saying?
I'm saying that our goal is to continue to push to repeal and replace Obamacare. We're committed to doing that. That hasn't changed throughout the campaign. That was something we talked about and something we talk about every single day that we're here. We're focused on doing that, and we're going to continue pushing forward. That's it.
Sarah?
Abby?
Sarah, so outside of the White House a couple of weeks ago, Mitch McConnell said either Republicans will agree to change the status quo or the markets will continue to collapse, and we'll have to sit down with Senator Schumer. So he was suggesting that sitting down with Democrats would be a consequence of Republicans failing to repeal and replace Obamacare. Is McConnell and the President, are they on the same page about whether or not they really do want to work with Democrats on this? McConnell seemed to indicate that that was the plan B, not plan A.
The President has said all along that he's happy and willing to work with Democrats on repealing and replacing Obamacare.
But do you guys believe that that's the way the process has actually unfolded in the Senate?
In terms of Democrats being unwilling to come to the table, yes.
In terms of whether the Senate Republican leaders have been open to Democrats?
I think Democrats laid out very clearly from the very beginning of this process they were unwilling to come to the table and have that conversation.
Sarah, I want to ask you about the Iran deal. It's been reported that the President was reluctant to certify that Iran is in compliance. Can you give voice to that reluctance? Just how reluctant was he?
I think, as everybody in the room knows, the President has talked about this pretty extensively, and his opinions and his feelings on this deal have certainly not changed. He still very much thinks it's a really bad deal, and that the Iranians have not been fully compliant. And we're going to continue through this process. And I refer you back to his statement to see where he lays that out pretty clearly.
One more question. To follow up on the lunch today, he sat with enlisted men and he heard from them what they think should happen. Was the President seeking a second opinion from what he's hearing from the commanders? Or I'm just curious why he wanted to hear from the enlisted men.
I wouldn't call it a second opinion. I think it's important for him to have that type of engagement. I know that's something that matters to him, not just on specific policy issues, but just to be able to have that type of open dialogue with the guys that have the boots on the ground. And he'll want to be able to continue to do that throughout, his time in office.
Sarah, both you and the President have suggested that Obamacare is simply dead. In fact, though, there are millions of people who still depend on it, and the President has decisions to make, as was noted earlier, the payments to insurance companies and subsidies. He can push this over the cliff, as Senator Schumer said a short time ago. He has the power to do that. It's not simply going to fail on its own. He has the power to do it.
I disagree with you. I think we're seeing it fail day after day after day as millions of people...
Well, if it's already failed, it can't fail day after day after day. You're saying it's dead. You're saying it's dead. It's not dead. There are still millions of people, many of them the forgotten men and women you like to talk about, who still depend on it. And he has the power to kill it dead. He has the power to push it over the cliff. Are you saying he's already made the decisions on subsidies and payments to insurance companies that would finally kill it?
No, that's not what I'm saying. Again, in terms of Obamacare being dead, it's an unsustainable program. When something is unsustainable and it can't be revived...
You're not saying it's dead.
I do.
There are people who depend on it. Millions of people, many of them your supporters,
Right,
his supporters.
and
How
that's
could it
why
be dead?
that's why the process that of repealing and replacing would need to make sure that those people are continued coverage, and that's been a big focus and one of the priorities of this process throughout from the beginning.
Is he going to help push it over the cliff?
Again, I think this is already going over the cliff and doesn't need a push by the president.
Sarah, when you've spoken to the president earlier today, said that this system will continue to collapse and will get to a point where Democrats have to come back to the table and join in trying to find a way to fix it. What specifically does the administration think would be that point where we would get a group conversation that has not happened yet?
I think that's a question, frankly, you'd have to ask the Democrats. I think they're the only ones that know what's going to bring them to the table.
You're the ones who keep saying that there's going to arrive a point at which the system has failed to such a degree that suddenly there's a willingness to compromise. So, like, what are you envisioning?
Well, I can't
Failures
imagine
of
that. I can't
individual
imagine that
plans?
as this program, as he laid out, goes deeper and deeper off the cliff.
You're either off the cliff or not off the cliff. You don't go deeper and deeper off a cliff.
What is the point that you're describing?
The point is Obamacare is simply unsustainable. We've said this 100 times.
But you're saying
it's
you're
not a
gonna revive
program
that
that can
point.
be revived. It is essentially a dead program in terms of being able to provide the type of health care that Americans need and deserve. And our point is the priorities that the president has laid out. We have to have a plan in place that actually provides care, not just coverage, that brings the costs down, lower deductibles, across the board reform. And at this point, hopefully Democrats will see how bad the system is and come to the table.
What specifically is going to happen to bring them back to the table?
Again,
Other than, you're saying it's unsustainable, it can't be supported.
I would
and the
think that
president is
those
saying it's
things
going to get to a
alone
point where Chuck
should
Schumer
wake
knocks
up
on the door.
Democrats and make them want to come to the table. Again, I'm not going to speak for the breaking point of Democrats, but I can't imagine that as we continue down this road, they don't come to the table to try to help save health care in this country.
You spoke before about the question about Syria. You spoke before about progress made in tackling ISIS. And U.S. backed forces have taken a couple more neighborhoods in western Raqqa recently. I was wondering, does the president have an opinion on who should control the city after ISIS is expelled?
I haven't had that conversation, but I would certainly refer you to members of the national security team, and they might be able to help lay that out more clearly. Thanks so much, guys.
Hi there, and welcome to the ABC News briefing room. You just heard Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the White House podium. You only heard her, you didn't see her, as is the new normal. Joined here in our newsroom by John Santucci, who is covering Donald Trump as long as anyone, from that first escalator ride all the way to today, interpreting so much of what's going on over at the White House. Catherine Falders, one of our White House reporters, has been tracking all the numbers around this and covering all of these briefings. And over at the White House, ABC News Chief White House Correspondent Jonathan Karl, who was just in the room, also got some time with the president himself, which we're going to get to. But John, this is a big day because it's a day that we can declare death. Death to not just one, but two different healthcare efforts. The White House position is that Obamacare is dead. And of course, we've run the numbers, we've seen the math on Capitol Hill. The replacement efforts are also dead. So have you got the official diagnosis in from the White House about what's alive, what's dead, and what could possibly still be kicking here?
Yeah, we do. We actually got that very emphatically from the press secretary, actually from the president as well earlier, but from the principal deputy press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who I saw. You did not, Rick. I saw her because I was there in person. Video cameras are banned, but we are allowed to look. So if you're there actually in the room, you were able to see. And she was, in fact, standing at the podium when she gave the diagnosis. And the diagnosis is this, Rick. It is the Democrats who killed the Republican health care plan. That may surprise you because, as I think you've probably seen, the Republicans, it turns out, control both the Senate and the House.
I believe that to be the case,
That
John.
is true,
It is.
yeah.
And what's interesting here.
So,
Go ahead, John.
here's what she said, and you heard this here. She said specifically of the president, he is not going to own the failure of Obamacare. The failure of Obamacare, I think, rests solely on the shoulders of Democrats. They created the program. They pushed it through. They made this legislation happen. They need to own the failure of it. and she made it clear that it was the Democrats who were to blame for this failure to repeal and replace it, because not a single Democrat would come along and support this Republican effort.
So guys, they never even tried here. I mean, come on. There was never an effort by the White House to reach out to Democrats. They never thought there would be. Trump today talking about this 48-4 thing. That's just Republicans. They were never going to get Democrats.
That's just Republicans, and exactly right. When the two senators came out last night about this was a totally Republican-driven effort here. You know, this isn't about the Democrats not coming on board. It's their own party, frankly. It's losing their own senators, and frankly, what a member of our team pointed out today was a tweet from Trump in 2012 when he attacked Obama, when he said Obama's complaints about Republicans stopping his agenda are BS since he has full control for 2 years. He can never take responsibility. There's a little irony here, right, John?
For everything from Donald Trump, isn't
there? They always come back to bite him in this way. But yeah, I mean, the fact that he is not engaged Democrats at all, hasn't had them over for dinner. He had a couple people for lunch today. We know that, John, you actually spoke to the president today when he was having lunch there, and said right there that he was frustrated and disappointed with the fact that they could not get health care through.
So we got Mary Bruce up on Capitol Hill, who's been tracking everyone down, and we're gonna play that clip with of President Trump and John Karl in a few minutes. But as we all know, they needed 50 votes. We knew that was the effort. They lost John McCain's vote. That was going to leave them just at that potential 50. Then two conservative senators came out yesterday, put him at 48. That's not enough. That means back to the drawing board, trying to get 50 all over again. It looked like they were right there on the razor's edge, Mary Bruce. And then what happened? You got a couple of names.
What's on that board there?
These are numbers, John. Numbers. This is pure math.
I'm doing the math
50,
over here.
48.
Not more math, guys. You know I don't do math. That's not my thing.
Okay.
We've already
All
been
right.
over this.
I'll take your word for it.
The problem, though, guys, is that even since what you just described, which happened last night, that initial plan to repeal and then come up with a replacement immediately, ever since that has gone down, we have already now run through an entire another cycle on what I think is Plan C. Stick with me here. So even this concept barely even got off the ground today. In fact, by the time lunch rolled around, this thing had come and gone. This was the plan to go ahead and bring up this vote simply on a straight repeal, then to work out at some time in the future the replacement, giving themselves 2 years essentially to come up with a plan to replace this. I mean, 2 more years after they've had 7 to work on this, that was still also up for question. But now we've already seen 3 Republicans come out and say they can't get on board with that plan. We've heard Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, Senator Shelley Moore Capito all say that they cannot support a plan to simply repeal and then work out the replacement at a later date. They're concerned about the uncertainty that this would create in the markets. They're really concerned about the uncertainty that this could create for average Americans. That fear of what would happen if you lived in limbo, that concern of what would happen if you knew your health care was going to be repealed, but what would come next. And let's be honest, when it comes to creating these sort of self-imposed deadlines, well, the people in this building don't necessarily have the greatest track record of meeting those self-created deadlines. So it doesn't seem that this vote is going to become a reality, but that's not stopping Republican leaders from actually having this vote. Senator Mitch McConnell has already announced that they're going to go ahead, they're going to have this vote, even though it seems to be doomed essentially at this point, simply because they want to get Republicans on the record on this. 7 years, their signature promise to the American people. They want to make clear who's going to vote against repealing this and who's going to have to go home, face their constituents, and explain why they voted to oppose it.
But then, Mary, it sounds like you and Rick Klein suffer from the same problem. You both are terrible at math. Because this, to me, Mary, sounds like we're now going to Plan D here. Because C isn't going anywhere.
Hey, wait, that's the alphabet. That's not math, Santucci.
That's right. Totally different letters, numbers.
Those are letters. Going through the alphabet.
But actually, I'm glad you raised this because I was just down in the basement talking to Senator Lindsey Graham, and I asked him this question. Okay, so if you can't get Plan C done, what's Plan D? And he kind of chuckled and said, look, we could go all the way to Z, X, Y, and Z. And I, not exactly giving us a lot of optimism here, but the question is, okay, if repeal and immediately replace isn't going to do it, if repeal now and replace later isn't going to do it, does it mean pause for the collective gasp that you now have to have Republicans work with Democrats, that ugly, nasty, bipartisan word? Are we going to have to see them go down that path? And Mitch McConnell has called for that in the past. You've heard members of both sides of the aisle say they're willing to work together to fix some of these issues with Obamacare to try and stabilize the markets. But Mitch McConnell just now said, well, we'll see.
because as always, the devil, it's in the details.
So, as you mentioned, it's getting messy, and we've got really the possibility of a Republican civil war. Sarah Huckabee Sanders was asked about this. Does this mean that the White House might take on Republican senators? He went out and talked about how we got to get more Republicans elected. This plays right into Democrats' hands, but John Carl, it sounds like the possibility of the president, the White House, and White House-backed groups going after Republicans very much on the table right now.
Very much on the table. The president this morning, talking about what was going on, pointed out that most Republicans, he said, were loyal, and terrific, and hardworking, raising the possibility that those that weren't supporting this were disloyal. And I asked the president specifically there at that lunch meeting if he thought these Republicans that failed to support this bill and caused its death were disloyal. And he went back to that word that we heard him use a lot, disappointed. He said, I'm very disappointed. He didn't repeat the loyalty issue, but clearly he is irritated by this. He had told Pat Robertson a little over a week ago that he would be angry if this did not pass. So I would say that retribution against those Republicans is very much on the table, very much on the table.
So John, you mentioned that, and I want to show people this clip, but first point out, we didn't expect that we'd hear from the president at all today. A very light schedule, as has been the norm. John, before we play this clip, set us up for what's the situation like when you are that close to the president? Do you think he's going to answer your questions? We all see reporters jostling to get close and to get within earshot, but what was it like inside that room today?
Well, first of all, we were given the president's schedule this morning, and it listed several events, but they were all closed press. So we were told that there would be no chance for us to be in the same room as the president. The American public would not see him as a result in public today. And then after the White House called what they call a lunch lid here, that means that everybody whose responsibility it is to do the kind of pool duty coverage of the president can go have lunch because nothing's going to be happening for another hour. They called the lunch lid, and then just as people went out to start to go get a bite to eat, we got word, hey, the president says, come on in. We're going to do a quick, what they call a pool spray. So this was very hastily arranged. You go in, this was in the Roosevelt room. Rick, you've been in the Roosevelt room. It's one of those two rooms in the West Wing that has a nice big conference table. And we get brought in there, and he gives opening remarks, and then he says thank you, and they start shooing us out. And that's my cue to try to get a question to him.
Love it. We love it, John.
That's his staff's cue to try to get me out before I can ask a question.
I love it. I love it. But let's watch what happened.
Lengthy answers.
Let's watch what happened. Here's what the president said when John Carl pushed.
Mr. President, are you angry at the Republicans who came out against this health care bill?
Disappointed. Very disappointed. I don't think it's dead, no, but I'm certainly disappointed. For 7 years I've been hearing repeal and replace from Congress, and I've been hearing it loud and strong, and then when we finally get a chance to repeal and replace, they don't take advantage of it. So that's disappointing. We're going to have to go out and get more Republicans elected in 2018, and I'll be working very hard for that to happen, okay? It would be nice to have Democrat support, but really they're obstructionists. They have no ideas. They have no thought process. All they want to do is obstruct government and obstruct, period. And in this case, think of it. So many good things, we didn't get one vote, and their plan has failed. And by the way, Obamacare isn't failing. It's failed. It's gone. So I think something's going to happen. We'll find out. Stay tuned. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Mueller said
We also heard from the president, not going to own it, John. What do you think?
Well, I also liked that apprentice style. I think something's going to happen. I mean, we're waiting. We're waiting.
Why not? Guys, what's fascinating to me about this process is how removed the president has been from it. He was very involved in the House.
Yep.
The Senate, kind of nowhere.
Not so much. And even the fact of those dinners, he had a lot of members over at the House wooing people for lunches, dinners, just even chats would call people over. It seemed like this go around with the Senate kind of seemed last minute. I mean, the fact that none one on the Hill really knew about this dinner until Sean Spicer said it in yesterday's off-camera briefing, it's kind of weird for what was going on there. You would have thought that they would have been a little more, open with their playbook. But maybe there really wasn't much of a play here.
And I think it's worth pointing out too there, though, not only the involvement, but the lack of strategy here. You look at the members who came over for dinner to the White House last night, but none of these were a threat, right?
Random list.
Random list. So when he tries, it's we're not quite sure of the strategy there.
So also, guys, a little bit of news on the Russia front. Sarah Huckabee Sanders asked about the possibility of Jared Kushner not getting security clearances. She ducked on that question. But we also know now, and John Santucci, you've got some reporting on this, that Paul Manafort and Donald Trump Jr. both have clearance to appear.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be there.
It doesn't mean that they're going to play ball here. So our understanding is that Donald Trump Jr. has not been contacted yet by Senate investigators. That's either Senate Intelligence, which had really been driving this investigation, or Senate Judiciary. When it comes to Paul Manafort, though, who's obviously been the target for most of these investigators for quite some time, we have just learned from a source with knowledge of their conversations that Manafort is not committed to meeting with the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, that in and of itself is pretty explosive, considering that Feinstein said to our reporter not too long ago that they have the green light, come on in. The other half of that is that Manafort apparently does not have access to his campaign emails. And that's really, as we've seen, emails can really tell us a lot what happens in his campaign. So he really can't prep for the testimony and really get in there to know what's going on. Pretty stunning, actually. I was pretty surprised when I got that phone call not too long ago.
And John Carl, is there concern about this question of security clearances, or do you hear just such loyalty to Jared Kushner as the president's son-in-law, sort of unfathomable that he could be on the outs with the president himself? You'd think they'd vouch for him.
Well, look, the president is the one that has the power on these issues, frankly, and I've heard no serious discussion of Jared Kushner being stripped of his security clearances. Although it was interesting to hear Sarah Huckabee Sanders so muted in her defense of Jared Kushner. But I think this is an issue that Democrats have jumped on because Jared is right there in the West Wing, unlike Manafort and unlike Don Jr. He is somebody that is, has all the top clearances and is dealing with the big foreign policy issues with the president. But I would be shocked to see him stripped of his security clearance.
Okay, lightning round as we wrap up this edition, the second edition of the Briefing Room. Mary Bruce, we're going to start with you. What are your takeaways? What did you learn today, other than how to count from A to Z? I guess we all got to do.
Yes.
26 letters,
Thank you for helping me out with that. Yes, besides the math tutorial. I think the big takeaway here today up on the Hill, going back to the healthcare issue, is that when you look at the big picture, where does this go from here? Assuming you get through Plan Z, and Republicans finally have to go forward, that in order to fulfill their signature promise to overhaul Obamacare, Republican signature pledge to the American people, they may actually have to work with Democrats.
Oh my. John Santucci, what did you learn today?
I think that this is going to be a very strenuous couple weeks here as we all try to count how many different plans they're going to have and who's up, who's down. I think that's part of the other part of it is that I think, going back to, I'm sure Mary and the team are hearing up on the Hill about how this investigation is going forward with judiciary. This is going to still be a very long process. And I think that, many of us thought that some of these initial question sessions would be wrapped up by the summer. Doesn't appear like that's going to happen. I think we're going to keep going with Russia into the fall, winter, spring. I forget what comes after that.
They cycle all over again.
Exactly.
Over to you, Falders. What's your takeaway?
I think Mary touched on it a little bit, kind of like the bigger picture going forward here with healthcare. If you look back to the first interview that Trump did with 60 Minutes, he said, we're going to repeal and replace simultaneously. Then we're going to let Obamacare fail. Then we are going to repeal it, and then we'll replace later, and now we're back at Obamacare fails. So I think really digging into where the president actually stands on this issue right now, what his strategy is going forward. I know Sarah spoke about it, but maybe he should have a press conference, Rick.
We'd ask you some questions. Okay, John Carl, over to you. What are your final thoughts from today?
Well, the biggest takeaway is we've declared the Republican health care plan dead in the past, and it turned out that it was able to come back from the dead. Today we saw it really die, and not just the idea of this replacement plan, but even the idea that they had passed so many times before, including as recently as December of 2015, it simply, they cannot do it. They cannot do it. Obamacare is the law of the land and will remain the law of the land.
And as for me, I think we learned today that the strategy is that there is no strategy. You heard from the president himself that you're going to attack Democrats, you're going to attack Republicans. I'm going to work on this. We may replace it. We're not going to replace it. they have not figured this out. And the president's own role in this, that we always thought would be so critical, the consummate deal maker, he was outside of this.
Close it.
All right. Our thanks to Mary Bruce. Our thanks to Jonathan Karl. For John Santucci, for Catherine Falders. That's it for this edition of The Briefing. We will be back tomorrow. Audio, video,
Whatever.
all of the above,
We'll be
whatever
here.
we got, we'll be here. Thank you for watching, and of course, click on us next time.